Part 1. The Stonebreaker's Son. Chapter 1. Monchaka. 1 month ago. Stonebreakers. That's what they call us. We're the bulwark, the best of the best in the Dwarven army. We stand on the front lines, taking the hardest shots our enemies can dish out, come hell or high water. That's our family's heritage. My father, Arik Ironhenge, is a stonebreaker to his core. He serves as Supreme General to the Dwarf King of Khazak Thul. In our clan, it's his way or no way at all. Don't get me wrong, Father's no fool. He knows other dwarves have their uses. The Ragers are valued because of their unquenchable lust for blood. The War Priests are venerated based on their fighting prowess and their skill with wounds. Hell, even the Bolters are given a grudging respect, knowing they can be counted upon when needed. Then we have the Engineers. My father barely acknowledges their existence, and when he does, it's only to deride them. "Bunch of lily-livered cowards," he'd fume. "Any dwarf that's afraid to go toe-to-toe with the enemy is no kin of mine." As Arik's only son, there has been only one choice for me. I've been trained from birth to be a stonebreaker. There's just one problem. I'm terrible at it. On the whole, dwarves are a stocky race, built much like the rocks we mine, solid, tough, and thoroughly unforgiving. Me? Well, I'm something of an enigma. Taller and leaner than my kinfolk, I stand out for all the wrong reasons. While not a complete weakling, I lack the compact strength of my brethren, especially when it comes to holding the front lines in battle. It isn't all bad. At least, I don't think so. Lanky as I am, I'm one of the swiftest dwarves in the kingdom. With these long legs, I can outrun anyone in our clan. Furthermore, our battle strategists tell me that I've shown a keen mind for tactics, a real student of war. My father, being the way he is, heard none of it. "You don't get respect running about delivering messages," he'd growl. "It's earned in battle." For me, it was stonebreaker or nothing. In the spring of my 19th year, everything changed. My father was leading a division of dwarves, some 800 strong, to the Grimdale mines. That's when the raging horde attacked. Boiling out of the mountains, several thousand wildly screaming orcs and goblins swarmed my father's force. Seeing how precarious his position was, the general set up a hasty defense and called for his fastest runner to carry a message to the king. Ironically, that meant me. "Tell King Helfer we are besieged," he said grimly. "We'll hold on as long as we can. However, without reinforcements..." He didn't finish his sentence. Even a soldier as inexperienced as I was could see the division was doomed. "Yes, General," I answered, pressing my lips together somberly. "Go," he snapped, "and hurry back, lad. When the fighting begins, I want you on the front line right at my side. Honor will be ours." I nodded once and turned away. I didn't give a damn about his honor. I just wanted my father and his company to live. I knew getting aid to the division was of paramount importance. I blitzed my way past the horde's advanced scouts just as they closed their trap on my father's division. Chancing a look back, I saw how dire his position was. Surrounded on 3 sides by the Saluskins, my father was backed into a corner with nowhere to run. There were some natural fortifications at the base of the cliffs, where a few boulders had fallen through the years, but those, I knew, wouldn't be enough. It was only a matter of time. I turned and ran, focusing my efforts on returning to the garrison as quickly as possible, some 12 miles distant. 2 hours before dusk, I staggered into the keep and made my report to the king. Sadly, it was not the only piece of bad news he received. Our enemies had had a busy winter. The yellow-skinned vermin were attacking dwarves up and down our lands. 3rd Company over by Dunhill had been decimated on their way to the fortress at Snow Peak. They returned with fewer than 50 survivors. A shipment of wheat from the winter fields had been set upon by yet another horde, with nearly 1/3 of its defenders slain. One by one, runners came in, each with a disaster to report. With the kingdom in a state of pandemonium, His Majesty couldn't muster enough forces to save everyone. "The general is no mean soldier," he said to me when I asked what message I should carry upon my return. "I cannot risk more lives to save him. If he can hold out for a week, I may be able to dispatch aid. As things stand now, I'm calling all available warriors to gather here and help those we can." I felt my chest go cold. Father didn't have a week. He'd be lucky to last a day. I understand, sire," I responded, numb at the finality of his decision. "You don't have to go back," the king said, not unkindly. "One soldier won't sway the balance in his favor. I've no wish to see you die in vain. The general would understand." "No, sire, he wouldn't," I disagreed, my heart dropping into my boots. Bowing swiftly, I left the war hall in a daze, stunned at the king's words. That was the day I discovered destiny has a funny way of sneaking up on you. There I was, tromping down the corridor, uncertain of what I should do, when destiny chose that exact moment to intervene. "You Aric's lad?" a voice asked from off to my left. I looked over and spotted a dwarf, trim like me, standing a finger's width shorter than I did. He was leaning against a carved statue of the dwarven high god Goran, standing in the full light of the setting sun. Though the dwarf carried at least twice my years, his green eyes sparkled with the vitality of youth. "Aye," I grunted, wondering who he was. "I'm Monchaka Ironhenge." The dwarf reached under his leather jerkin and pulled out a white clay pipe. "Ashton Rain," he said, in a manner of introduction. "Captain of the Grey Company." Despite the concern I had for my father, I cocked one of my eyebrows in surprise. The Grey Company was legendary. That wasn't the right word, more like infamous. A group of mercenaries who worked for the highest bidder. Professional, yes, but loyal only unto themselves. 30 of the roughest bunch of dwarves you ever laid eyes on. Every one of them an engineer. I nodded in acknowledgement, curious as to why I'd captured his attention. Ashton withdrew a small pouch from his pocket. "The finest leaf this side of the Arundel River," he said, expertly packing his pipe. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, irritated at the delay. If I'd upset him with my tone, he hid it well. Instead, he smiled through his thick brown beard and lit his pipe, using a magnifying glass to capture the light of the sun. "No, lad," he said, as the embers flared. "I was thinking I might try saving the general." My face must have betrayed the confusion I felt, because Ashton's smile broadened. "Dozens of times in the past the general has risked his arse to save dwarven lives. I'd be a poor excuse for a kinsman if I missed this opportunity to return the favour." My heart leapt at his words. This was the last thing I'd expected. A smile sprang to life on my face, but died a quick death moments later. "The king has ordered every dwarf available to gather and await his directive," I frowned. "He'll not risk you for the general's division." Ashton laughed in genuine humour, stroking the brown braids of his beard. "I don't take orders from the crown," he answered, with a hint of sarcasm. "Helfer hoards his gold like a maiden protects her virtue, till he starts paying the company and I go where we please. In this case, we have a mind to save the general." My chest swelled with hope, until another thought hit me like a kick to the stomach. "You work for pay?" "I do," he replied, blowing smoke through his smile. My face hardened with determination. "I don't have much, but whatever the cost, I'll pay it." "Well, you know," he asked, his smile fading. "It's unwise to bargain without first knowing the terms." "I meant what I said," I snapped firmly. "Whatever the cost, I'll pay it." Ashton puffed thoughtfully on the stem of his pipe and exhaled slowly. "All right," he said affably. "We'll discuss the price after the deed's done, so long as you agree to deliver. For now, we'd best prepare." "We?" I blinked in surprise. He gave a snort. "Aye, did you not think you'd be invited? You've first-hand knowledge of the terrain, and you've escaped once from the Salaskins already. A lone runner, racing through hostile country, living by your wits? I wouldn't ask you to join us. We want you to scout, and, if the need arises, to fight alongside my company." "But I'm trained as a stonebreaker," I protested. Ashton smiled. "Nobody's perfect." Within the hour, I had exchanged my heavy suit of banded armour for a cuirass of boiled leather. It was a shade loose around the waist and spotted scotch marks along the backside, but otherwise seemed serviceable. Next, I handed over my pitted battle-axe and reinforced iron shield. In return, I was given a sturdy knife, its curved blade 10 inches in length, along with a black-hafted hammer, more a tool than a weapon. Finally, I was handed a rifle. Measuring some 3.5 feet long, it fit my hands perfectly. This wasn't some ceremonial piece made for hanging over the mantel, but a true instrument of war. As I studied the weapon, one of the Grey Company, a grizzled veteran wearing a patch over her left eye, paused and watched me closely. "Here." She unslung a worn leather bandolier from over her shoulder. "Since you're taking my place tomorrow, 30 shots of lead, laddie. Make 'em count." I noticed her left leg was wrapped in blood-stained bandages. "Damn Sally ambush," she explained, seeing my look. "Goblin archer got off a lucky shot before I could lay him low. Haven't had time to see a priest yet." "My thanks," I answered, with a quick nod of appreciation. Taking the bandolier, I dropped it over my shoulder. The elder she-dwarf nodded and limped away. "Wait," I called out. "What's your name?" She tossed me a wink over her shoulder. "I'll tell you when next we meet." The she-dwarf turned the corner and limped out of sight. At that moment, Captain Rain strode up to me, accompanied by a fierce-looking female. "This is Ghost." He nodded at the newcomer. Her dark eyes were mirrors of my own. "She's my second in command. You two will be walking point together when we depart. I've asked her to give you a few tips about your new gear. I know there's little time, but I thought it best you learn something about that rifle. We don't want you accidentally blowing your hand off tomorrow on the road." I couldn't tell if he was joking or not. I spent the following hour debriefing Ashton and his other 2 lieutenants. The first was an older dwarf, tall like me, with a face so wrinkled it appeared dried by too many days in the sun. His name was Badderson Sarl, but everyone called him Bad. He was missing the pinky finger on his left hand and had a tiny barrel of whiskey the same size as my fist tucked inside his greying beard just under the chin. Armed with a sour disposition, Bad knew more about explosive concoctions than anyone else in the company. He peered at me from beneath a pair of thick goggles, but said nothing other than to ask the captain an occasional question. The second lieutenant was so small I nearly mistook him for a child. I was never told his proper name, but Ashton referred to him as Ratchet. Nearly as young as I, Ratchet had a forked blonde beard and any number of tools hanging from the belt around his waist. He wore an overly large, conical helmet with a wrench latched in place above his right ear. Young as he was, Ratchet was one of the finest tinkers in the entire kingdom. He oversaw maintenance on the mechanical turrets the company employed, along with the other technological gadgets his squad utilized. Ratchet had a nervous habit of twitching his nose every few minutes, but he listened quietly, watching with steady blue eyes. Ghost was away on some errand, while the 4 of us pored over a map highlighting the area where my father's division was trapped. Ashton was meticulous in his questions, asking me things Arik would have considered trivial. What terrain covered each part of the valley? Was it made up of grass, dirt, trees, or other types of foliage? I endured at least an hour of questioning before he was satisfied. Long after sunset, I was dismissed. I thought I'd get a bite to eat and then grab some shut-eye, as the company was set to leave before dawn the next day. However, Ghost hunted me down and spent over an hour instructing me on the use of the rifle. Her lesson included how to load and reload the weapon, along with teaching me its basic care and maintenance. The dark-eyed dwarf grudgingly let me squeeze off a few rounds, all the while tutoring me on the fundamentals of riflery. She spent a handful of minutes going over the various types of grenades the company utilized, and under what circumstances to use them. At the end of our time together, she looked at me and snorted to herself. "Maybe, just maybe, you'll be an asset tomorrow." She handed me 2 metallic spheres, shrapnel grenades she'd called them, and walked away. "Wait," I called out, holding the cold iron orbs like they were live vipers. "When do I use these?" "When things go to bloody hell," she called back, ominously. Not exactly the confidence builder I was hoping for. Staring at the grenades, I attached them carefully to my weapon belt, praying they wouldn't explode in my face. Needless to say, I didn't sleep very well that night. It was at least 4 hours till dawn when Ghost jostled me awake. Eyes sandy with exhaustion, I climbed out of the uncomfortable cot and set about gathering my things. I secured the weapons first, triple-checking the grenades to make sure their pins were in place. My backpack was laden with enough food for 2 days. Someone had placed a coil of rope and 3 flasks of oil in the pack, along with a full canteen, a telescope, extra ammunition, and a watertight box containing flint and steel. Hardly standard issue for a stonebreaker, but common enough, I guessed, for an engineer. After strapping the bandolier in place, I threw on the smoky grey cloak Ghost had given me the night before. Lastly, I hauled the backpack over my shoulders and took a moment to study my companions. Say what you will about engineers, but those of the Grey Company were steely-eyed and ready. Most carried more gear than I did. In addition to their packs, they shouldered turrets and tech equipment of every shape and description. Each bristled with weaponry in the form of knives, pistols, hammers, and rifles. Only Ghost was as lightly burdened as I. Slight as she was, I wasn't surprised. She did, however, carry a 4-foot rifle slung over her back, the longest such weapon I'd seen. Once they'd finished packing, the 30 of us exited the barracks in an orderly fashion and rolled out the front gate. The 4 guards stationed there, stonebreakers all, shook their heads and turned away. So much for the fellowship of dwarves. That's how we began our trek under the stars, on a mission to save the general. "Stay close and move quietly," I heard Ghost mutter in my ear from near the front of the column. "As sure as the sun rises in the east, the sallow-backed sons of bitches will have a scouting force out looking for easy meat. It's our job to find them before they find us." I smiled, despite the situation. Something I noted about Ghost, she didn't mince words with anyone, not even the captain. For 2 hours, we moved as quietly as 30 heavily laden dwarves could. Quickly at first, our pace slowed after the first hour. Ghost and I were up front, 50 yards ahead of the rest of the company. As luck would have it, it fell on me to discover a group of our enemies. The sallow-skinned species make for a motley crew of hardy opponents. Tough as nails and as nasty as they come, the orc race is all savage strength and power. Goblins, on the other hand, are infused with equal parts magic and mischief. Crafty bastards, they numbered in the tens, if not the hundreds of thousands. Both races have contested with my people for centuries, and, working together, form a fearsome enemy. They make for terrible scouts, though. I could hear a band of them some 30 paces away, arguing amongst themselves, oblivious to my presence. Out of nowhere, Ghost rose up from the ground next to me, her eyes fixed on the sounds in front of us. "What's your call, Stonebreaker?" she asked quietly. I paused, caught by surprise. "You're asking me?" "Aye," she nodded. "Let's see what Arik taught you." I blinked once, considering the alternatives. "How many are there?" I asked. No more than 50, she replied. It's an advance force sent to waylay a unit like ours and warn the main army ahead. We could have gone around the group and left them behind with no one the wiser. This held momentary appeal, as tackling an advance party of Sallowskins was not our primary objective. However, leaving them alive would mean they could fall on the next company of dwarves that came this way. There was also the issue of being caught between this group and the main force that had trapped my father. If we wanted to beat a hasty retreat, we'd need to have a clear path back to the garrison. We eliminate them, I said, more to myself than to Ghost. The corner of her mouth curled into a smile. My sentiments exactly. I discovered some interesting things about my comrades during that skirmish. For a bunch of lightly armed and armoured warriors that usually deal death from a distance, I was amazed at how well the engineers fared in hand-to-hand combat. Captain Rain gave the order for a silent attack. That meant no rifles, pistols, grenades, or turrets. And absolutely no explosions. He raised an eyebrow with a long look toward Bad. The old grenadier's shoulders drooped in resignation as he yanked out the largest spanner he owned. Ghost led her squad of sharpshooters past our enemies, making certain not to alert the Sallowskins to our presence. I was left with Ashton and the main force, who would strike from the front and drive any survivors toward Ghost and her dozen. Our attack commenced as the pale light of the moon crept from behind a ghostly cloud, bathing us momentarily in silver. We moved quickly, with less noise than a dandelion's pappus bellowing in the wind. Our adversaries didn't know what hit them. Using knives and hammers, the only sounds that broke the silence in those first few seconds were the meaty smacks of metal striking flesh. More than a half score of the enemy died in our initial attack. One of them, a huge orc warrior wielding an iron war club, took Ratched's knife in the stomach and let out a roar of pain. The sound alerted the rest of the camp that something was amiss. Drawing my knife from the chest of a goblin, I took careful aim and hurled my hammer toward the wounded creature's temple. I heard an audible crack of dwarven steel striking bone. I watched in grim satisfaction as the orc's head snapped backward, his neck broken. Despite the warning cry from the orc, it was already too late. Like wraiths rising from a graveyard, the Grey Company raced through the enemy camp, killing without mercy. A handful of Sallowskins that were out of our reach had enough sense to make a mad dash for safety. They were summarily impaled and bludgeoned by Ghost and her crew. Before I could catch my breath, the battle was over. The attack had been executed perfectly. Not a single dwarf had suffered so much as a scratch. I couldn't help but wonder at the efficiency of this company. 30 engineers, a group as ragged as any I'd encountered, had wiped out nearly 40 of the enemy in less than a minute with nary a sound. As I looked around in wonder, I caught Ghost staring at me. She picked something up from the ground and sidled her way over. "Nice throw," she said, brushing a wisp of dark hair from her eyes. She handed me my hammer and turned away. A memory, long buried, stirred. For just a moment, when she'd brushed her hair away from her face, I felt as though I'd met her before. "We've a few miles to go, lad," Ashton said from behind me, interrupting my reverie. "Get back up there with Ghost and keep your wits about you. This may not be the only group we have to contend with." Chapter 2. Reckoning. Whether it was luck or overconfidence on our enemy's part, we covered the rest of the distance without mishap. It was more than an hour until dawn when we arrived at the Grimdale Cliffs. The valley was covered in shadows, save for the dancing lights of distant campfires. I could see thousands of orcs and goblins surrounding the knot of dwarves trapped at the base of the escarpment. On the northernmost flank, I could make out several machines of war in the light of a waning bonfire. I counted a half-dozen catapults and one rudimentary trebuchet. The horde must have rolled them out of the mountains last evening, else they would have already pounded my father's division to dust. Ashton pulled Ghost and me aside, waving for his lieutenants to join us. All right, we've gotten this far, he began. Let's see if our luck holds. Bad, he continued, looking at the wrinkled dwarf. Take 6 of your squad and set up some fireworks along the northern flank. I want those war machines reduced to ash before our primary attack. That should cause the distraction we need. Wear the clothing we took off the Sallies, but for the love of Andovar, keep to the shadows. None of you are ugly enough to pass for a goblin, not even you. Bad snorted softly with laughter. Tell Kirin to prepare the field in front of us in case we need to leave in a hurry. Ashton leaned in, getting back to business. Have Stearns and Higgs gather the extra oil and assist her.
You want them seared, blackened, or charred?
Bad asked, rubbing his hands together. You decide, the captain answered with a grunt. But keep your squad's noise to a whisper. All it takes is one dropped wrench and we're cooked. Bad nodded and shuffled off. Ratchet, you and yours get those turrets ready, Ashton said to his tinker. If it comes to any kind of drawn-out fight, their operation will mean the difference between life and death.
You want them in front of Kirin's field, or where we stand now?
Ratchet asked, swinging his head toward the field in question. Put the majority behind it, but leave 4 or 5 of the most mobile ones in front to support Ghost's group, and we better have Donia make a keg of her brew. I want it up here, he said, pointing at a group of boulders nearby. That'll be our fallback position if things turn against us.
She'll be cutting it close.
Ratchet's voice rose in pitch, his nose twitching rapidly.
Donia needs at least 2 hours to mix it properly.
Then tell her straight away, Ashton replied. Sticks can help if you can spare her. Ratchet put a knuckle to his forehead and slipped away without another word. As for you, he said, turning to Ghost and me, you two have the most difficult task. He sat down on a rock and took out a piece of parchment from inside his jerkin. Using a flat, metallic plate drawn from his pack, Ashton began scrawling on the parchment with a quill dipped in ink that appeared from some hidden pocket on his person. You need to sneak past the enemy and deliver this to the general, he stated without looking up. I frowned in confusion. We should be able to accomplish that without difficulty. Most of the Salaskins are asleep. Next to me, Ghost snorted and shook her head. Getting in isn't the hard part, she said without humour. It's convincing the general our plan is a good one that will prove difficult. He's the cog that needs grease in this little operation, else the whole thing falls apart. We made our way past the sleeping horde with relative ease. The few that were awake weren't watching for anyone moving closer to the dwarves, only those trying to escape. Our disguises stood up under any cursory looks we may have received, and before I knew it, we were through the enemy encampment. As I walked past, I could see that dozens of dwarves had been slain since I'd left. Most had been hauled back to the edge of the dwarven defences, though a few were still laying out in the open where they'd fallen in battle. Hundreds of enemy corpses littered the ground, more than 3 times the number of our dead. With their numerical superiority, the Black Bloods could afford those losses. We could not. I took off my helmet upon our arrival, nodding my way past the dwarven guards. Ghost hung back from me a bit, keeping herself out of sight. It didn't take long for my father to make his presence known. "What in the name of Gorin are you wearing?" he cursed, stomping over to me. "An engineer's rig. Take that off and put on your armor. Where the hell are my reinforcements?" "Father, please," I said quietly, leaning my rifle against a large stone. "I bring word from the king. Dwarves have been attacked all over the realm. He could not send aid, not with our forces scattered as they are." My father's eyes dropped to the ground. "I feared as much," he muttered under his breath. Raising his gaze, he flashed me a look of pride. "Then we will die a hero's death," he said proudly, a grim resolve in his voice. "Come, lad, find a suit of mail from one of our fallen brethren. We'll show this piss-coloured rabble the might of Clan Ironhenge." With those words, he began to walk away. I knew I couldn't let him. No, I said simply. He stopped and turned, looking at me coldly. What did you say? I stepped forward. I said no, General. We don't have to die here today. The king could not send aid, but others have volunteered in his stead. I watched as my father's eyes darkened in the torchlight. Who? He hissed. Knowing what his reaction would be, I braced myself. The Grey Company, you hard-headed dolt, I heard Ghost snap as she stormed past me. The expression in my father's eyes changed from dark anger to a blazing fury as he advanced forward, stopping only inches from her face. What in the hell are you doing here? He demanded. Are you the reason Munchaka is dressed in these cowards' clothing? Shut your bleating mouth, she snarled back, giving as good as she got. If you had half a brain in that cavity you call a head, you'd not be in this predicament. What's that supposed to mean? He barked at her, ready to explode. It means if you'd had an engineer to scout, you could have avoided this ambush, she shouted back. Instead, you're too arrogant to think anyone but your precious stonebreakers are worthy enough to fight at your side. I saw him clench his fists and knew they would come to blows. Ghost did not shrink back. Instead, she raised her chin, daring him to strike. That's enough, both of you, I snapped, stepping between them. We've no time for this. Reaching under my cuirass, I pulled forth a folded parchment. This is a plan concocted by Ashton Rain, the leader of the Grey Company, I said, looking at my father. Follow it and we can all escape from here with minimal losses. Otherwise, the crows will be picking over our corpses by mid-morning. The kingdom is under attack. It needs its general. If you and your division are lost here, our people will die with you. We need you, father. Don't throw away your life because of your pride. I only ask that you follow Ashton's plan. It was the first time in my life I'd ever stood up to anybody. I think the shock of it gave the general pause. He stared at me for a long moment before snatching the parchment out of my hands. When this is over, lad, you and I will have a reckoning, he hissed, without looking at the parchment. And you, Aurora, he snapped at Ghost, will leave Kazakh Thule forever. I don't take orders from you anymore, Arik, she spat defiantly. I'd just as soon leave you to die here along with your stupidity, but the lad here wants you to live. Lucky for you, he's worth a battalion of your soldiers, else I'd leave you here to rot. Turning around, Ghost strode back the way she'd come, leaving me gaping in astonishment. Follow the plan, you hard-headed jackass, she called out behind her, else you're all dead in the valley. Looking at me, the general spoke, his voice shaking in rage. Come, Munchaka, else you'll never be a stonebreaker, he growled, crumpling the parchment in his fist. No, I answered quietly. What did you say to me? He hissed. I turned to him, my mind made up. I said no, I repeated. He made to speak again, but a raised hand from me stopped him. Do you know why Ashton volunteered to come for you? I asked. He said dozens of times in the past the general has risked his arse to save dwarven lives. I'd be a poor excuse for a kinsman if I missed this opportunity to return the favour. I paused, letting those words sink in. He and his company respect you, father. That's why they've come. They wouldn't let you die here in this valley, not if they could stop it from happening. You are worth more than that. I reached up and put my hand on his broad shoulder. I'm proud of you, father, I continued, giving him a smile. Proud to be your son, because Ashton is right. You always give of yourself. For the first time since I'd known him, he was listening, truly listening to what I had to say. I know you don't care for engineers. They're not what you consider true dwarves to be. Well, I've spent less than a day in their company, and I can tell you this. They are brave, strong, and as loyal to the dwarven cause as you or I. You've always taught me that actions speak louder than words. Well, look around. Your friend, the king, didn't dispatch a single soldier to come to your aid. He tried to dissuade me from returning. No one else is here. Only the Grey Company. Their actions speak volumes as to who they are, just as you taught me." I reached out and took the crumpled parchment from his hand, smoothing it out as best I could. "Look at Ashton's plan," I urged him. "He's certain it will work." My father's eyes flicked down at the parchment, then came to rest back on me. "What of you?" he asked quietly, still smouldering. "Will you not stay and fight by my side?" With a sigh, I picked up the rifle I'd been given. "I cannot stay. I'm sorry, Father, but the company needs me more than you do." "You think these engineers can be trusted?" he scoffed with a sneer. I shrugged. "All I know is if you don't act, none of us will leave this valley alive. Ghost told me that you and your division are the most important cog in this machine. We can't do it without you. Give them a chance. They may well surprise us all. It's your choice, Father, but I trust them as much as I trust you." With that, I ran after Ghost, catching up to her in moments. "Aurora?" I asked. "Not anymore," she fumed. "That was my clan name before my brother banished me." I paused, stunned at this new information. "Your brother?" I asked, grabbing her by the wrist. "Yes," she answered, ripping her arm out of my hand. "That idiot general is my elder brother, Arik. I was once his sister, Aurora Ironhenge. He wouldn't let me near you as a child. Heaven forbid you follow in my footsteps." She placed the orc helm she carried back on her head as we approached the enemy lines. "We need to get back," she snapped. My mind raced. Only a deep rift between the siblings could have caused Aurora's exile, as clan members were notoriously loyal. Despite her anger, it was clear she still cared for him. I ceased my musings in the face of the upcoming danger. Our family's drama could wait. I put my orc helmet on and strode after the only person I'd ever seen defy my father's command. Upon our return, Ghost made her report to Ashton, while I waited with her squad of sharpshooters. They were a close-knit group and spoke quietly to one another, ignoring my presence completely. That suited me fine, as my mind was still reeling from the morning's revelations. Sunrise was but a quarter-hour away. Already I could see light beginning to glow beneath the horizon. Most of the horde was still asleep, though a few camps were beginning to stir. When Ghost returned, she took her squad to the southwestern side of the enemy encampment, using the boulders and underbrush as cover. She left us in strategic positions a few paces apart from one another. I was the first one placed, along with a young sniper named Cora. She had black hair, a pretty face, and seemed none too pleased about being saddled with me. From our position in the underbrush, I could make out hundreds of enemy tents in the pre-dawn gloom. Each was made from neatly sewn animal hides. The closest was less than 40 yards away. There was no movement from inside the tent, but I kept my eyes open for any sign of trouble. "You should close your left eye," Cora whispered to me. "What?" I asked, startled at her voice. "Your left eye," she said again. "Keep it closed, Stoney." "Why?" I asked, glancing over at her. "It helps maintain night vision," she explained, looking at me like I was the biggest lummox in the kingdom. I pressed my lips together in a grimace, but said nothing. Stoney, she'd called me, short for Stonebreaker. I let out a sigh. No matter where I went, it seemed I struggled to fit in. "It shouldn't be long now," she muttered, craning her head around the boulder in front of her. "What are we waiting for?" I dared to ask. She shook her head and frowned. "What do you think?" she scoffed. "We're waiting for Bad's distraction." "How was I supposed to know that?" I snipped back, feeling a touch of embarrassment. She paused and turned back to the tent. "I thought the captain informed you when you spoke with him earlier," she explained with a sniff. "He didn't tell me any specifics," I replied, a bit shortly. "I don't even know what we are doing out here." I could feel her eyes rolling in the darkness next to me.
I always have to break in the newcomers, she murmured under her breath.
What? I asked, getting annoyed.
Nothing,
she mumbled, scanning the encampment with her open eye.
When Bad's distraction goes off, things will get busy here in a hurry. Whatever you do, don't shoot. Wait for the sallies to rush away. The last thing we want is the horde looking for us here in the open. Once a large number have committed to the northern camp, we'll open fire.
I waited a few moments, digesting her words. How will I know when to attack? I asked cautiously. She sniffed again.
You won't. Wait for Ghost. When you hear the report of her sniper rifle, you'll know.
I had another question, but I didn't want to sound more ignorant than I already felt.
Spit it out,
Cora snapped. What? I asked, wondering if she'd read my mind.
I know you have more questions, she answered, and I hate waiting. Besides, poking fun at you helps pass the time.
I knew she was teasing me, but I asked my question anyway. Are there any of the enemies I should target in particular? Or should I just blast away? I saw the beginnings of a smile work its way across her face.
I'm charged with finding goblin shamans, she answered quietly. Though our squad tries to focus on any caster we see, archers as well. You're new. If you hit anything with sallow skin, I'll be impressed.
That was enough information for me, and I really didn't feel like talking to her anymore. Dawn arrived, and the enemy encampment rose with it. Quickly, I checked my weapons and ammunition. The grenades Ghost had given me were still hanging from my belt, along with the knife and hammer. I saw Cora place several bullets at the ready on the boulder in front of her. I mimicked her actions, earning a satisfactory nod. Now, all we had to... A deafening explosion rocked the northernmost encampment, waking everyone in both armies. One of the catapults nearly disintegrated under that destructive force. A massive plume of fire and smoke bellowed into the sky, briefly illuminating the entire valley. Seconds later, 5 successive detonations went off, each louder than the last. The wood and metal of the remaining catapults were torn to pieces. The trebuchet collapsed, reduced to nothing more than burning embers. To say the horde was taken by surprise would be an understatement. Fires flared up at the edge of the northern encampment as dozens of smaller explosions went off, burning both tents and flesh alike. Screams of pain and rage echoed through the valley, sure evidence that Bad and his crew had commenced with their attack. I glanced at Cora, who was smiling, shaking her head in wonder. I realized at that moment, standing under the glow of dwarven pyrotechnics, that she was an exceptionally beautiful female.
What does he put in his gunpowder? She mused to herself, still smiling.
She caught me staring at her like a moon-eyed calf and cuffed me on the side of the head.
Stay focused,
she hissed, as the smile ran away from her face.
Bad and his squad are pulling the army to them. We need to weaken the forces here so your big bad daddy can ram through.
I nodded sheepishly and turned back toward the encampment in front of us. Our enemy's response was faster than I'd imagined, though highly disorganized. Hundreds of orcs and goblins ran streaming from the camp located on the southwest side of the valley. Scores of creatures scurried past, some passing only a few yards in front of us. As the seconds turned to minutes, a massive orc, a black iron chain wrapped tightly around his chest, emerged from a large tent to our right. I saw him gaze north and then turn toward the boulders we were crouched behind. A single rifle shot cracked through the crisp morning air. The orc staggered back a step and dropped to his knees before falling bodily upon his face. Ghost had entered the fray. A rapid staccato of gunfire could be heard off to my right as other members of her squad let loose. Next to me, Cora snapped off a shot and I saw a goblin archer drop instantly.
That's one,
she muttered in satisfaction. At the same moment, a second goblin, this one dressed in ritualistic garb, exited the tent and stared at Cora's hiding place. A shaman.
Bloody hell!
I heard Cora curse as she frantically reloaded her weapon. The shaman lowered its staff and moved its hands rhythmically, gathering its mystic power. There was no time to lose. I shouldered my rifle, hearing the echo of Ghost's words from the previous evening. Take aim and exhale. Pause halfway through. Easy on the trigger. Too hard and your shot will go wide. Squeeze it slowly and your bullet will fly true. Once you're ready, fire away. I fired away. A high-pitched burst of gunfire reverberated in my ear. It was immediately followed by a jolt of the rifle's recoil against my shoulder. I watched as the lead bullet tore through the throat of the shaman, spraying dark blood in a fine mist, killing it where it stood. Dazed, I glanced over at Cora, who looked at me, stunned.
"Reload, dummy,"
she barked, aiming, taking out another target.
"One lucky shot doesn't make you a ruddy marksman."
For the next few minutes, the squad fought, killing scores of the black-blooded creatures while ducking, bobbing, and weaving behind whatever cover they could find. Ghost had taken out their squad commander, leaving the Sallowskins in our vicinity with no immediate leadership. Finally, one of the orcs got savvy to our game and led an entire company toward our position. Seconds later, Ghost appeared next to us along with the rest of her squad, the enemy hot on their heels.
"Fall back,"
she screamed as a handful of arrows sliced through the air over our heads.
"Get to the turrets and we'll re-engage."
I grabbed the pack I'd set on the ground, turned, and ran. Retreat was not something a stonebreaker would do so readily, but under the circumstances, it made perfect sense to me. I chanced to look back toward my father's encampment, hoping to see his forces advancing. My heart sank. There was no sign of movement. We sprinted nearly 100 yards through the underbrush until I saw 5 turrets set up in front of us.
2 by 2 flanks,
Ghost barked, breathing heavily, reloading her rifle.
"Ratchet!"
she yelled, looking for the tinker.
"I'm here,"
he said, popping up from behind one of the turrets, wrench in hand.
"What have you got in store?"
she asked, wiping sweat from her brow.
"I've got a trifold accelerator hidden in the brush ahead," he answered excitedly. "I had an issue with charging it initially, but the primary discharge valve—" "I don't need a technology lesson," she snapped, shaking her head. "Just make sure it works."
Cora grabbed me by the collar and shoved me toward the end of the line.
"Reload and get ready for more,"
she ordered, panting next to me.
"Don't do anything stupid, Stoney. It's a wonder you're still alive the way you fight with your head sticking out all over the place."
She pulled out her water skin and drank from it deeply.
"Damn Sally's never quit,"
she muttered, looking in the direction from which we'd just run.
"By the trine, here they come."
The turrets, each manned by a tinker from Ratchet's squad, started booming away as the swiftest of our enemies came within range.
"Save your ammo,"
Ghost yelled, her voice steady.
"Let the turrets do their work. Ratchet, be ready,"
she snapped, her eyes never leaving the approaching Sallowskins. A handful of goblins fell to the repeated sounds of dwarven technology. A pair of archers stood outside the range of the turrets, but a quick salvo from our marksmen ended the threat in a hurry. More and more of the Blackbloods charged forward until over 50 orcs and goblins were in range. The turrets fired non-stop, smoke streaming out of their exhaust pods. Undeterred, the enemy continued their advance.
"Now, Ratchet!"
thundered Ghost, shooting a leather-clad orc ravager at point-blank range. The creature fell back onto one of its fellows, bellowing in agony. The tinker hopped behind a boulder and threw his switch with a maniacal laugh.
"Die, Blackbloods! Die!"
he screamed. A massive surge of energy hummed across the field, and nothing happened.
"God damn it, Ratchet!"
Ghost screamed as scores of the enemy raced forward, now only a few yards away.
"All hell's breaking loose! Switch that thing on!"
Suddenly, I knew what I needed to do. I reached down to my belt and ripped both grenades free. Pulling their pins, I whispered a prayer to Goran and let fly. The grenades bounced off a gigantic orc's hastily raised shield, and I saw the creature's face twist in confusion some 15 yards away.
"You crazy son of a... Everyone get down!"
Cora screamed, dragging me to the ground. That's when my grenades went off. A metallic burst shot outward in all directions, killing, maiming, and wounding anything that moved in a 30-foot radius. Yelps of pain and surprise could be heard from the enemy, located only a few feet away. When the dust settled, there was a foot-deep crater where the grenades had exploded. "Are you insane?" Cora screamed in my ear, looking up in the aftermath. "By the gods, you could have killed us all! I said, don't do anything stupid, you idiot, meat-headed stonebreaker!" In retrospect, I could see her point. The grenades weren't deadly projectiles and could have injured our fellow dwarves. However, they had managed to stem the tide, and that's what we needed in the moment. Not that anyone thanked me. "Got it!" Ratchet cried in glee as he flipped the switch again. A low hum emanated from the underbrush in front of us, and this time blue bolts of lightning shot outward in every direction. If my grenades had slowed them, then Ratchet's try-whatever accelerators stopped our enemies in their tracks. Dozens of sallowskins were electrocuted, while the survivors bolted for safer ground. "Sorry about the delay," Ratchet apologized, looking over the crisped corpses, smoke rising from each. "One of the binary cortex wires came loose." "Save it," barked Ghost, her eyes turning to me. "You said all hell had broken loose," I explained with a shrug, brushing dirt from my leggings. "What did you expect me to do, stand here and let everyone die? Besides, it worked, didn't it?" Ghost just shook her head and started muttering under her breath, something about greenhorns. "Next phase," she said, regaining her focus. "Fall back to Kirin's Field. Stick to the outskirts unless you want to roast with the Sallies. Ratchet, you and your squad get the turrets moved. We're going to need everything we've got." Again, we retreated, leaving more than 100 dead in our wake. I looked back toward my father's encampment. There was still no sign of him. I cast my eyes downward, my spirits falling. "Buck up, Stoney," I heard Cora say. "It's not over yet, unless of course Bad lets you near the flamethrower." I smiled, despite my concern. I wasn't sure how I could both like Cora and want to kick her at the same time. We regrouped at the east end of Kirin's Field, taking care to walk along the edge. I don't know what Kirin had done to it, but it smelled of tar and naphtha. Ashton was there, along with Bad and his crew. I noted Bad's cuirass was scorched in the exact same spot as mine, making me wonder if he'd been my armor's previous owner. So far, we'd been lucky. I counted 30 dwarves still standing, though there were a smattering of wounds to go around. I spotted the dark-haired she-dwarf named Donia climbing atop a pile of boulders near the entrance of the valley. Finishing her task, she sprinted over and joined the rest of us. "Bruise a mite underripe, Captain," she huffed. "But it'll do." Ashton nodded curtly and addressed us all. "Anyone see movement from Arik's camp?" he asked, his face like stone. There was soot along his neck, and blood ran from a cut on his cheek. "I've checked, sir," I answered, not quite able to look him in the eye. "They haven't marched, at least not that I could see." Ashton swore under his breath. "We're going to have the entire horde on this little patch of dirt in a few minutes. What the hell is he waiting for?" I looked at Ghost, who shook her head slightly. I knew she didn't think he'd come. "You should go," I said, casting my eyes at the entire company. "We won't survive without his help, and I don't know if he'll show in time." I glanced at Cora, who was staring at me without expression. "I know the field is soaked with some kind of flammable substance," I continued, swinging my eyes to Ashton. "I'll stay behind and fight it. Hold them off, so you and your company can escape. There's no reason any of you should die here. You fought unbelievably well against incredible odds. I'll stay and buy you time." I stepped forward and saluted Ashton, who was watching me closely. "Thank you for trying, Captain. You and your company are the bravest dwarves I've ever met." "They're approaching," Ghost reported, licking her lips. "Go, while you still have time," I shouted, turning around, running back to the field. I halted at the line of turrets and slammed a bullet home, surprised to see my hands were steady. Rifle loaded, I yanked the flint and steel out of my pack as the enemy continued their approach from across the field. Striking the flint against my knife, I frantically tried to catch a spark, knowing I was about to die.
"Idiot stonebreaker,"
said a voice from behind me. There was Cora, a frown on her face. "That's not how an engineer lights a fire," she continued, loading her rifle. What are you doing?" I stammered in surprise.
"We're not about to leave you behind,"
I heard Ghost say from the other side of where I was standing. At that moment, hundreds of the enemy came pouring onto the field, screaming for dwarven blood. "This is how engineers light a fire," Ashton muttered, falling in line next to Ghost. He took a red canister from his belt and pulled the pin. Up and down the line, every member of the Grey Company had come forward, each preparing for battle. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "You need to save yourselves!" "No, lad," Ghost said, smiling at me. "You're the one worth saving." She looked at Ashton, and her smile turned fierce. "Light it up!" she roared. Stepping forward, Captain Rain threw his canister into the middle of the field, one chock full of sallies. A blast of red-hot flame burst from the inside of the canister, and the ground underneath the sallow skins erupted. Scores of the enemy were incinerated in moments as the naphtha-drenched area exploded in a blazing inferno. Orcs and goblins howled in agony as they tried vainly to escape the flames. 1 minute passed, and the flames continued, roasting everything inside it. Sallow skins were climbing all over one another, trying to escape. A couple even ran toward us, yellow flesh burning, the naphtha clinging to their skin. I watched as the dwarfess Donia brained one as calmly as if she was striking a tent peg with a mallet. Another minute passed by, and the flames began to dim. By the end of the 3rd minute, the flames had been reduced to a smoulder. "Get ready," Ashton muttered, palming his last grenade. Up and down the line, rifles were shouldered and the turrets set to auto-fire. The company had no tricks left to play. On the other side of the field, hundreds of orcs and goblins, infuriated at the death of so many of their number, prepared to rush our position. "Aim!" the captain shouted, his voice as cool as a mountain spring.
"Good to have known you, Stoney,"
Cora said quietly, touching my shoulder with her hand. The last of the flames died out, and the enemy surged forward. "Fire!" Ashton roared, throwing a grenade into the midst of the onrushing horde. Every turret boomed, and every dwarf shot at the incoming mass. It didn't matter. I have to give it to the Sallies. Twisted and evil they might be, they fought like they were possessed. I saw one massive orc, known as a chain, take 5 bullets to the chest, and still he came forward. Hundreds of goblins rushed the field, one already littered with their dead without batting an eye. We had no choice but to run. "Fall back!" Ghost shouted as she hauled Ashton to his feet. The captain had taken an arrow to the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. "Come on, Stoney!" Cora screamed, letting off one more volley, then sprinted for the rocks behind us. En masse, the Grey Company ran for their lives, scrambling atop the boulders that would serve as our final defensive position. I watched as the sallow skins fought their way to the hated turrets, ripping them apart in frustration and anger. Ratchet stood next to me, tears streaming down his face at the wanton destruction of his machinery. "Push it through," Ashton growled, his teeth clenched in pain. "Bite down on this, love," Ghost replied, placing a wooden branch in Ashton's mouth. He nodded as she drove the arrow through his shoulder and out the other side in a burst of warm blood. "Get me close," Ashton said, his face white with agony. I noticed a keg of dark ale sitting in a hollow atop the boulders. Several members of the company had gathered around it. Each had been wounded in some way, but now, by some miracle, were healing.
"Donya's brew,"
Cora explained, sweat dripping down her face.
"You
drink it," I panted, winded from the run. She shook her head.
"Drinking it without distillation will tear your insides apart. The healing is in the fumes."
"I had no idea," I said, impressed once again. Despite our circumstances, Cora gave me a wicked smile.
Even if we die, the Sallies will be sure to quench their thirst. We'll take a few more before the day's done.
Ghost dragged Ashton over to the keg, and he breathed deeply, letting the healing vapours do their work. "The turrets are destroyed," Bad reported from over his shoulder, watching the horde with a sneer. "Orders, Captain." "We fight," Ashton answered with a grimace, rising to his feet. He yanked a pistol from his belt, stepping forward once more.
"I'm out of bullets," I said quietly to Cora as I drew my knife and hammer. She nodded once and loaded her rifle. "I'll cover you, Stoney."
Smiling ferociously, Bad ripped the tiny barrel from under his beard and guzzled a huge gulp in his mouth. Taking up a fiery brand, he held it in front of his lips, ready to immolate anyone of the enemy who got too close in flames born of whiskey. The last of the turrets were destroyed, and the Sallies eyed us for a moment, knowing we could not escape. Like a dam bursting, they ran forward, howling in rage.
"Dwarves of Rahm!"
echoed through the valley, checking the horde's advance.
"What's that?"
Cora whispered, her eyes everywhere.
"Dwarves of Rahm!"
sounded again, closer than before.
"That's the war cry of the Stonebreakers,"
I said, incredulously, scanning the landscape. At that moment, a fighting wedge of more than 600 dwarves rolled around the corner and rammed into the horde. At its head was Arik Ironhenge.
"Dwarves of Rahm!"
thundered through the crisp morning air. The Sallies might have been determined, but they weren't about to stand up to that armoured, churning mass of heavy infantry. As the tip of the wedge hit, it rolled over the orcs and goblins like an ocean wave, pounding against the shore. Our enemies died screaming in their hundreds. Predictably, the survivors panicked and ran for their lives, retreating to the safety of the main vanguard of the horde. Before I could blink twice, the battle was over. With the chaos of the field cleared, my father strode forward, glaring up at the Grey Company, still standing at the ready upon the boulders. "We've a reckoning, Munchaker," he spat at me, ice in his eyes. Yep, that's my dad. "If I may," the captain said, stepping forward. "Even with your forces, General, we're badly outnumbered. I think it best we return to the garrison at once." "And who are you?" my father asked, narrowing his eyes against the glare of the sun, unable to make out the captain's face. "Ashton Rain," the dark-eyed dwarf answered proudly. "Captain of the Grey Company." Arik snorted into his beard. "You have no authority here." The captain smiled. "Forgive me, General. Perhaps you've forgotten. It's Prince Ashton Rain," he said, shocking me to the core. "Leader of the Grey Company and youngest brother to King Helfer, who caved in for the first time in his life and commissioned me for this rescue." My father took a long, hard look at Ashton, who did not flinch under his gaze. "You haven't spoken to your brother in years. You expect me to believe that?" Arik barked. In answer, a ball of flame shot from the boulder to my right. Bad was standing there, breathing his mouthful of whiskey into a fiery sphere. "I'll not be wasting any more of my fine spirits on account of you, General," he snarled, his mouth finally empty. "You two can have your pissing contest later. The captain speaks sense. Let's be off." My father frowned, but nodded in acquiescence. Turning to his division, he roared out an order in his stentorian voice. "Stonebreakers, home!"
"Dwarves of Rahm!"
Hours later, we stood in the throne room giving our account to the king. Afterward, His Majesty thanked us for our service and told us to await further instructions. Captain Rain, or Prince Rain, I suppose, took us to the nearest tavern for a few pints of well-earned ale. As the second round arrived, he raised his hands for silence. After an eventful 24 hours, there's a final matter that needs to be addressed, he began, looking directly at me. A matter of payment, Monchaka. You promised recompense for our services, no matter the cost. I looked at him and nodded once. I did make such a promise, Captain, I said, rather grimly. Name your price. The Dwarven Prince smiled. You, Monchaka, you are the price. I request that you join my company as a full-fledged member, effective immediately. A stunned smile crept onto my face as cheers went up around me. Hands clapped me on the back and mugs were pounded upon tabletops. Well, Ashton asked, what do you say, son? I glanced at Cora, who raised an eyebrow and rolled her eyes. No, boomed the voice of my father. All eyes turned to the Supreme General of the Dwarven armies. His face was a mask of controlled anger. I knew our time of reckoning had come. Slowly I stood, my oak chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor in the stillness of the tavern. Quietly I stepped forward. There's a war coming, I began, looking him straight in the eye. I would fight in that war, Father, the best way I can. Despite your finest intentions, it comes down to a choice I alone must make. Before you raise your voice in argument, I beg that you hear me out. Arik nodded once, though his face did not change. Today, you saw a band of 30 engineers overcome incredible odds to save your division of Stonebreakers. Yet, that same division saved the engineers as well. The two forces needed one another. Working together, they accomplished something neither could effect on their own. Think of what more we could do given the opportunity. This is how you and I should be, General, not in contention, but working as one. Several heartbeats passed. Not a sound could be heard. I could almost hear the gears whirring in his head. I knew, for the first time in his life, the General was considering my words. All he needed was a little push. Before you answer, think on this, I continued, reaching out with a hand, placing it on his shoulder. How many warriors would you have lost without the Grey Company? How many more dwarves might we save together? If the king approves of his brother as an engineer, why can't you? Arik wet his lips, glancing over at Ashton. I smiled at him. Your sister, Aurora, has been right all along, Father. There is a place of honor for everyone in this clan, not just the Stonebreakers. If you wish for me to fight in this war beside you, I must do it under my own terms. That means it will not be in the banded iron of a Stonebreaker, but in the leather rig of an engineer. I withdrew my hand from his shoulder and extended it toward him. What say you, General? Arik glanced at his sister, who was glaring at him, awaiting his decision. A half-dozen heartbeats passed as the entire room held its collective breath. Finally, the General reached forward and gripped my forearm, taking it in the warrior's handshake. If it's to be war, then we'll be needing the entire clan, he boomed, grabbing Ghost, embracing her tightly. The exiled dwarfess burst into tears, squeezing him back. The crowd roared, swarming all three of us in hearty approval. Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't sleep. Not yet, anyway. I climbed up the stairs to the top of the battlements and looked out at the stars. We were under the king's orders now, as he'd finally agreed to fully finance his brother's company. Ashton Rain, I thought with a smile. What a difference he'd made. After the General had retired for the night, I asked the captain why he'd picked me. What had I done to deserve a spot in his company? His response was simple. A good dwarf such as yourself is worth more than a mountain of gold. You were willing to stay behind and sacrifice your life for the good of the company. Friendship, loyalty, doing what is right. Our deeds are what will be remembered in this life. You have those qualities, Monchaka. Everyone in your family does. That's why I asked you to join my company. Besides, he'd stopped, giving me a warm smile. Like Ghost, you're a hell of a scrapper. I smiled at the memory. I was touched by his words, more so because I could see that he meant them. I heard a step behind me and turned to see Cora come up the stairs. She'd pulled her dark hair back and was no longer geared for battle. She wore a simple white dress, cinched at the waist with a belt of black leather. I smiled at her, and she shook her head in amusement.
"What are you grinning about, Stoney?"
she asked, her tone playful. I shrugged offhandedly. Nothing, really. I just figured you came up here to thank me for saving your life today. She furrowed her brow in a look of disbelief.
"When did you save me?"
From that goblin shaman, I answered simply. He was about to blast you with his magic, and I saved the day. I don't know what had gotten into me. Usually I was shy around she-dwarves. Maybe I was succumbing to the effects of the alcohol, but for whatever reason, in that moment, I was feeling euphoric. She scowled at me, mostly, I suspected, because she knew that I was right.
"You got off one lucky shot and I'm supposed to swoon in your arms?" she scoffed. "Is that what you think, Stoney?"
I smiled, ignoring her question. You know what the best part of my day was?
"When I saved you from those grenades you threw?"
she asked, somewhat archly. No, I said, laughing at the memory. It was when I ran out of bullets, and you said you'd cover me, I answered. I knew you liked me then. She tried, God knows she tried, but she couldn't keep a smile from her face.
"I do not like you, but I suppose you aren't a complete waste of my time."
Stepping forward, she slipped her hand in mine.
"You are, however, an idiot. You know that, don't you?"
I leaned in and kissed her lips. They were soft and warm. I know, I answered. I'm an idiot engineer.
"Don't do anything stupid,"
she said, teasing me with her eyes. Oh, I plan to, I said, kissing her again.